I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Nkosana Moyo from the African Regional Development Bank. And you are the Chief Operating Officer, Vice President of the bank, which is seeing also a renewal, we should say, so very, very positive. And you have also been a minister. So I mean, you provide, and you have been working in basically investment also in the private sector. So again, we have another thought leader that basically can provide different kind of perspectives. So I look very much forward to hear what you have to say, basically. So please, Dr. Moyo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. First, let me set the stage. My boss was supposed to be here, so I'm here in a bit of impersonation perspective, I suppose. But Dr. Kaberuka was supposed to talk about his perspectives or awareness of PPPs from a Rwandan perspective when he was Minister of Finance. And by sheer stroke of luck, when Kaberuka was Minister of Finance, I was a partner for Actis, looking after our African investments. And I'm going to use a transaction to illustrate some of the issues involved here, which happened in Rwanda, where he and I were the signatories from opposite sides. So what actually happened was that we bought a bank from the government of Rwanda. The World Bank had recommended for them to privatize. This was 2004. And as all of you know, Rwanda was coming out of a terrible period of genocide, and so its institutional framework was completely destroyed. And it's interesting to hear Tona talking about a regulatory framework because there was none. So here we were as a private equity investor going into a country where we wanted to make a difference and contribute, but fully aware of the risks and the lack of that infrastructure in terms of legal framework and so on. So we had to think quite carefully about how to structure the partnership or the investment. And the government offered to sell the bank 100%. And we decided it was not prudent to buy the bank 100%. So we persuaded the government to stay in that particular investment to the tune of 20%. We wanted them as an insider, in a good way. I'll come back to this. So we wanted the government to stay with us as a partner. So hence the private-public partnership issue. And that way we could develop an infrastructure from a legal framework point of view, regulation of the financial services sector together with them. They to see from inside everything we did. And so when we recommended things that they should do, they understood that it was not from a partisan perspective. We're interested in the interests of the sector, and they could see for themselves. So we created in what would be called in private equity perfect alignment. Our interests and their interests were aligned. Easier said than done. Remember that we were not the only player in Rwanda. So our perfect alignment with government as an institution created a problem in this sector because the other players were not in a similar investment with government. And their perception was that we were being favored because they were not privy to what we did with government or didn't do with government. So in there, I think we keep coming back to something that Richard alluded to, and I was smiling as we were speaking because you created a world in which there is perfection. Unfortunately, time and time again, in the arrangements of human endeavor, there's always going to be a balance of forces where in fact there is coexistence of opposites. And if you're lucky, those opposites cancel each other out and leave you in the place you want to be. If you're not lucky, they leave you in the wrong place. Yeah? So in creating our alignment, we created a problem for the sector, a problem of perception and credibility for the government because other players in the sector were saying, this government is not creating an even playing field. They can't be both a player and a referee at the same time. Yeah? So alignment on one side and lack of alignment on the other. This investment, I have to say, was not a perfect experience, as again you will understand. So what were the issues? Again, issues maybe we should have been able to foresee from right up front. The view of the world from the public sector just is not the same as the view of the world from the private sector. The two are very different. And so the relationship is always going to be a tense one. Why is that the case? The government or public sector creates public goods by and large, and they're supposed to create an even playing field for all of the economic players in the country. If I'm running a business in a particular country, I look after my interests, or to be more precise, after the interests of my shareholders, stakeholders now, trying to stretch it a little bit. But the two constituencies are not the same. They can never be the same. So if you then combine a public sector investor in a partnership with a private sector investor, you're creating a mismatch in terms of the constituencies that they are serving from the very beginning. And that requires very careful management. And if you're investing in a territory where, so we're talking, let's say FDI, because I was working for a British company, again, the perception from outside of a continent or a country will never be the same as the perception from within the country. And thence another tension which you have to manage. And in my business or in my company, in my partnership, what happened time and time again was that I found I became the troubleshooter in our investments in Africa. I became the relationship manager. I became the conflict sort of resolution expert, even within our own company. Why? Part of the problem is that the Western world, by and large, has become a rules-based society. Rules-based, contractual-based, you sign a contract, and that's how the relationship is determined. In Africa, and I dare say in developing countries, we still manage things according to relationships. You get to know me well, we can resolve virtually anything. But if you think the piece of paper you signed is going to determine what you get out of me, you're mistaken. Yeah? So you find that time and time again, people literally do what we call cutting their nose to spite their face, in spite of a contract. So there is a need for a clarity that in operating in emerging markets, you have to invest more in relationship building than in the contracts that you write and sign. That's just fact. So you can imagine the kind of job I had trying to be the partner responsible. The other component that we need to take on board is that a government, by definition, is responsible for looking after the interests of its people, including issues which are not commercial. And therefore, again, if a government is delivering and being true to its responsibilities, its mandate is going to be broader than a particular commercial investment. And there, again, you're going to have a lot of friction and need for understanding, good dialogue, and putting yourself in the other side sort of shoes, if you like, understand it from their perspective. They try to understand it from your perspective, and I think you're in a good place when that happens. They are after voters. You are after looking after investors. Very different constituencies. So I think as we have this dialogue about PPPs, let's not be naive that all is a bed of roses, because it's not. I think the potential, however, is very high, and I think in many aspects of African economic development, the answer has to lie in PPPs. But I'm just putting a good health warning that be prepared for some of the challenges. So I've touched on the issue of conflict resolution, that invest in relationship building. It will allow you to have a relationship which works, which can resolve conflicts and the like. Now, at this point, before I discuss the next point, I want to digress a little bit. In the past 5 years, every single investment conference I've been to, China has always come up. I want to use this particular element to illustrate something else. So China comes up, and the implied issue about China investing in Africa, the implied, I'm going to push the boundaries a bit, because it's never spelled out that way. The implied issue is that China is not a good partner for African countries, either because of human rights issues, environmental issues, and the issues go on. And my response to this is always that you cannot have a dialogue about China investing in Africa without a triangulation. What do I mean by that? You have to look at Europe and Africa. You have to look at Europe and China, and then China and Africa. And then look at what goes on in investment flows, in trade, and you'll find that whatever dimension you look at, the flows between China and Africa are minuscule compared to either FDI directly into China or trade between China and the West. And then historically, you find that Africa is where it is not because of China. Africa is where it is today, primarily because of its relationship with the Western world. So why do I use this to tee off my next issue? My next issue is that in public-private partnerships, national interests tend to get in the way, in a big way. And I think part of the unfortunate thing is that the conversations that take place are not trust-enhancing. They tend to be conversations which are almost like an insult on the other party's intelligence. Yeah? Because the conversation about China and Africa is insulting to a lot of Africans because of the picture I've just painted for you. And when you do that, it means from word go, the element of building trust is undermined. It's undermined before you even start, which means the quality of the relationship in terms of the quality of the dialogue, the ability to resolve conflicts is again undermined before you start. But if you start up front by having an honest conversation, you build a bridge which says, I am trying to connect with you in a manner that builds a win-win situation, which is absolutely pivotal in terms of building successful private partnerships. The other complication is that when we're talking about PPPs in Africa, the private component, unfortunately, tends to be foreign, as opposed to significant private but domestic African investors. So with this backdrop of a history which is troubled, which we need to own up to, and then trying to create a relationship which is fundamentally problematic. If you look at Europe, for instance, you find time and time again, but because of the homogeneity of the players, it's easier to sit around a table and resolve the issues that arise. But when you don't have that homogeneity, the challenges escalate. And again, so don't underestimate the fact that when you're doing FDI into a PPP in Africa, you're operating at a fundamentally challenging level. And Kofi Annan mentioned something which is absolutely important yesterday. Whenever you do that, to the extent possible, get yourself a local partner. The local partner may not have the cell phone technology understanding, the technical understanding, but more often than not, they will help you manage the environment better than you can on your own. Again, let me throw out a challenge which I've perceived and I used to challenge my British colleagues on this one. It fascinates me that when Western companies go to invest in China, when they go to invest in Japan, they understand this issue intuitively. They understand if you go to do business in China, you're going to have to find Chinese people who tell you how to behave in China. If you go to Japan, you're going to have to find Japanese people who tell you how to behave in Japan. But time and time again, I find companies coming into Africa and they think they can do it alone. I dare say, even in the development community, same thing. And again, I think there is need for a pause for thought to just say, so what is at play? What is different? What do people think is different about Africa? Let me digress a little bit. It's not a digression, really. So far, I've talked about the private sector issue. I'm with African Development Bank. Some of the issues that challenge us today are similar to what I've just been discussing. So a lot of you will be aware of the Paris Declaration and the Accra Accord. And it's quite interesting because these particular declarations or accords are trying to tell us to align much more closely with the interests of the recipients or beneficiaries of our interventions. So let's not call it aid, but interventions. That although you engage with a community which appears to be less technically competent, ultimately you're going to make more progress when you ground yourself in the way they do things and start from there. Understand their interests, understand their worries, understand what they're trying to solve, and use their systems to start with, and they build the capacity from there. Don't try to impose your capacity on that community. It doesn't get you very far. So it's a big challenge even for us, because we go there and we get impatient, and because we know what we think, we know what the answer is, we try to do it our way. But actually, the amount of time you lose in doing it that way far exceeds the investment time you'd get by simply saying, I'll work with you and I'll use your systems, and I'll partner you and use your platform, which is where we're trying to force ourselves to move to. And I think in any public-private partnerships, try to do the same. Understand your environment and put a lot of emphasis on relationship building, and I think it will work much better. In conclusion, therefore, I'll say the issue of alignment is one of the key issues. Understand and try to build a win-win. The interests of the other party and yours must be aligned as much as possible. That way you remove a lot of friction. Manage the environment, accept that it's a territory you don't understand, and use local knowledge, which allows you to create more productive dialogues, which allows you to then resolve problems as they arise, because they will always arise. There will always be conflicts, and you cannot resolve them without local knowledge. Do not try to impose your world on the other world. Very simple. Just try to take it for what it is and work with it, as opposed to imposing your world on the other. Now, the enabler. I liked the enabler issue. One of the key challenges we find is, I suppose, the concept of institutionalization. A lot of things do not work in this space, whether we're talking investments, or whether we're talking aid or development or whatever. The institutionalization, which goes beyond the people of the day, is our key challenge. But again, I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why this space is so difficult. And the answer I've come up with for myself is, again, that we all tend to be very impatient. And we try to transpose our world into, let's call it their world, as opposed to saying, I'll get more traction if I go and understand whatever the little village in the middle of nowhere is. If I go there and understand their own institutions and work with them and demonstrate that I care about their solutions, it's easier for them to then follow me. Thank you very much.